Clara Mercer had the revolver raised when her wounded horse pulled away from the barrel. The old chestnut should not have been able to move that fast. His front leg was swollen nearly twice its normal size, and dried blood had turned the bandage around his ankle almost black. Yet instead of standing still, Jasper twisted his head north, toward the mountains. Then he started walking. Clara lowered the gun. 3 days earlier, she had left the remains of her Arizona homestead with one canteen, a sack of beans, a blanket, and enough seed to fill both hands. Now the canteen was dry. The beans were nearly gone, and the horse she had owned for 16 years was dragging one injured leg across a stretch of country where even cactus had begun to die. There was no good reason to follow him. Clara followed anyway. The summer of 1887 had burned the land down to its bones. Dry creek beds split into long cracks. Cattle skulls lay beside empty troughs. Fence posts leaned over fields where nothing had grown since the previous spring. The wind carried dust through everything. It slipped inside Clara's collar. It coated her teeth. It settled in the corners of Jasper's eyes. Behind them, nearly 20 miles away now, stood the cabin where Clara had spent 23 years with her husband, Thomas. She had not looked back when she left. There was nothing there that could feed a woman. Nothing there that could water a horse. The well had given its last muddy cup 5 mornings earlier. Thomas had been gone for 11 months. His grave rested beneath a cottonwood that had lost every leaf before June. Before leaving, Clara had knelt beside that grave and pushed several squash seeds into the powdery ground. They would never grow there. She knew that. Still, she had pressed them down with her thumb. "I'll put the rest somewhere better," she had said. Now the little leather seed pouch rode inside her dress pocket, tapping against her ribs with every step. Jasper stopped. His ears lifted. Clara nearly walked into him. "What is it?" The horse stared toward a jagged wall of red and gray stone rising from the desert. Old miners called those mountains the Broken Teeth. Most people in Dry River stayed away from them. There were no wagon roads there, no working mines, no known springs. Just stone, snakes, and narrow cuts where a rider could disappear from sight in seconds. Jasper started forward again. Clara caught his rein. "No," he pulled. She tightened her hand. The horse pulled harder. His injured leg trembled beneath him, but he kept turning toward the mountains. Clara looked at the colt still hanging in her other hand. That morning, she had taken it from Thomas's saddlebag because Jasper's wound had begun to smell wrong. She had planned to make it quick. 1 shot. Then she would continue west alone. Instead, Jasper was fighting her for the first time in years. Clara studied his face. His nostrils widened. He lifted his muzzle into the wind. Then Clara remembered something Thomas had once said at their kitchen table. It had been years ago, during another dry summer. He had returned from hunting mule deer near the Broken Teeth and told her he had watched 3 deer vanish between 2 slabs of granite. Not climb over them, not go around, disappear between them. Thomas had laughed when Clara asked what was inside. "Something worth walking into rock for." She had forgotten those words until now. Jasper tugged again. Clara slid the revolver back into its holster. "All right." Her voice came out rough. "You get 1 chance." The horse walked north. If you've ever watched an animal notice something a human cannot, you know how hard it is to ignore the way they suddenly change. Jasper changed. His head rose. His steps became uneven but quicker. Every few yards he stopped, lifted his nose, and chose another direction. Clara stopped guiding him. She simply stayed beside him. By afternoon, the heat had tightened the skin across her face. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She found herself thinking about water in strange pieces. A wash basin, rain running off a porch roof, Thomas pouring coffee, a bucket swinging over the old well. She forced the pictures away. Jasper climbed into a narrow rocky draw. The walls closed around them. The air changed there. Not cooler, but still. The wind could not reach between the cliffs. Clara heard Jasper's hooves scrape against stone. Then he stopped before a granite wall. Clara stared. It rose nearly 30 feet above them. There was no trail, no opening, nothing. Jasper had led them into a dead end. Clara rested both hands on her knees. Her breathing came short. For several seconds, she watched drops of sweat fall from her chin and disappear into the dust. That was your chance. Jasper nudged her shoulder. She pushed him away. He nudged her again. Then he walked toward the wall. Clara straightened. Jasper. The horse turned sideways. For one strange second, half his body seemed to disappear into stone. Clara blinked. There was a split in the granite, a narrow black seam hidden behind a fallen slab. Jasper squeezed through it. His saddle brushed rock. Then his hindquarters vanished. Clara stood alone. She listened. One hoof scraped somewhere inside, then another. And beneath those sounds came something else, a faint, steady tapping. Clara stepped closer. Cool air touched her face. She stopped breathing through her mouth. There was a smell coming from the crack. Not dust, not horse sweat, not hot stone, wet earth. Clara pressed one hand against the granite. The rock was cold. She turned sideways and entered. The passage scraped her shoulder and caught at her skirt. For several yards she could see almost nothing. She kept one hand on the wall. The stone beneath her palm grew damp. Then Jasper gave a low grunt ahead of her. Clara took 3 more steps. The passage opened. Light fell through a narrow hole high in the mountain roof. It landed in the middle of a stone chamber. Jasper stood beneath it. His muzzle was buried in a clear pool. Water ran down the far wall in thin silver threads, gathering between green moss and dark rock before slipping into the basin. Clara did not speak. She crossed the chamber on shaking knees. She dropped beside Jasper. Both hands went into the pool. Cold water closed around her fingers. She lifted it to her mouth. One swallow, then another. Then she bent forward and drank directly from the surface. Water ran down her chin and soaked the front of her dress. Jasper drank beside her, until his sides stopped heaving. Clara finally lifted her head. That was when she noticed the stones near the far wall. They had been arranged in a circle. Inside them lay old gray ash. Someone had made a fire here, long before Clara arrived. She stood slowly. Beside the fire ring, scratched into the rock, was the shape of an open hand. And beneath that hand were 7 small carved marks. They looked like seeds. Clara reached toward them. Before her fingers touched the wall, Jasper's head snapped toward the narrow entrance. His ears locked forward. Clara heard it too, a hoof striking loose stone outside. Then another. Someone else had come into the mountains. Clara dropped beside the pool and pulled Jasper back from the water. The old horse resisted until she pressed one hand against his muzzle. Outside, stone shifted under another hoof. Then came a man's voice. Low, close. Easy there. Clara's fingers tightened around Jasper's nose. The narrow entrance was 30 feet behind her. If the rider found it, there was nowhere else to run. She looked around the chamber. Pool. Fire ring. Garden soil. High opening in the roof. No second passage. She drew Thomas's Colt and moved toward the crack. Jasper followed until she turned and lifted one finger. Stay. The horse stopped. Clara squeezed into the narrow passage. She did not go all the way outside. Instead, she found a shallow bend where the granite opened just enough for her to stand sideways and look through a finger-wide gap toward the draw. A rider came into view. Then another. 3 men. All carried rifles. The first man rode a black gelding with white foam dried around the bit. He was broad through the shoulders and wore a pale hat stained dark around the band. The second man carried a coil of rope across his saddle horn. The third kept looking at the ground. Clara recognized that kind of looking. Thomas had done the same thing when tracking deer. The man was reading hoof marks. Jasper's hoof marks. Clara slowly looked down. There, in the dust, directly outside the fissure, were fresh prints. Deep ones. Jasper had entered on an injured leg, digging his good hooves hard into the ground. Anyone with eyes could follow them straight to the stone. The tracker dismounted. Clara held the colt against her skirt to keep the metal from touching rock. The tracker crouched. Horse came through here. The man in the pale hat stayed mounted. Wild? No. The tracker touched one print. Shod. Clara's mouth went dry again. The pale-hatted man looked toward the granite wall. Then somebody's up here. The third rider laughed under his breath. Who'd be fool enough to bring a horse into this country? The man in the pale hat did not answer. He got down. Clara eased backward through the passage. She returned to the chamber and looked at Jasper. The horse watched her. Your tracks. His ears moved. She crossed to the pool. For 1 second, Clara considered taking the revolver and waiting beside the entrance. 3 men, 6 bullets. Thomas had taught her to shoot tin cans behind the barn years earlier, but a tin can did not shoot back. She looked toward the ceiling shaft. A thin column of daylight still reached the chamber floor. Then she saw the garden patch. Loose, dark soil, moss, water. Everything those men were probably looking for. Clara moved. She pulled the saddle blanket from Jasper's back and spread it across the damp soil. Then she scraped loose gravel from the edges of the cavern over the blanket until the dark ground disappeared. She kicked old ash from the fire ring across the stone floor and scattered the circle. She gathered every broken pottery piece she could see and pushed them behind a low shelf of rock. Her hands moved quickly, not gracefully, not carefully, quickly. Outside, a boot scraped granite. They had found the entrance. Clara stopped. Jasper's nostrils widened. She took the reins and led him toward the darkest side of the chamber. There was a shallow shelf behind the moss wall where the rock curved inward. Not enough to hide a horse completely, enough to break his shape. She pushed him into it. Jasper stepped once, then froze. Clara pressed against his shoulder. A shadow moved inside the passage. One man was coming through. Clara raised the colt. A hand appeared first, then a hat brim. The tracker squeezed through sideways. He entered the chamber and stopped. His eyes went straight to the pool. Clara watched his face change. His mouth opened. He turned toward the entrance. Mr. Vane. Clara almost fired. Instead, she waited. The man in the pale hat squeezed through next. He entered slowly. He did not rush toward the water. He looked around first. At the walls, at the ceiling shaft, at the damp moss, at the pool. Then he removed his hat. Well, his voice was quiet. So the old stories were right. The third man came in behind him. He dropped to his knees at the pool and started drinking. Vane kicked the heel of his boot. Not yet. The man looked up. Vane pointed toward the water. Look before you drink. The tracker circled the pool. Clara held still behind Jasper. A fly crawled across the back of her hand. She did not move. The tracker studied the wet floor. Then he stopped beside the place where Clara had scattered the old fire ring. He crouched. These stones were moved. Vane looked over. Recently? The tracker touched the ash. Maybe. Clara felt Jasper's chest expand under her arm. She covered his nostrils again. Vane walked toward them. 1 step. Another. His boots clicked softly against stone. Clara raised the barrel until it pointed at the center of his chest. He was 15 feet away. Then 10. The tracker called from across the chamber. Got something. Vane stopped. He turned away from Clara. The tracker held up a strip of cloth. White cotton. Dark at one end. Clara recognized it immediately. A piece torn from the bandage she had removed from Jasper's leg. Vane took it. He rubbed the stained end between his fingers. Blood. Horse blood. Vane looked toward the entrance. Fresh. The third rider finally spoke. Then, Whoever owns that horse is close. Vane smiled without showing his teeth. Closer than close. Clara kept the colt steady. Vane walked back toward the pool. He crouched and dipped 2 fingers into the water. He tasted it. Then he stood. This changes everything. The tracker glanced at him. For Hollow Creek? Vane put his hat back on. For me. Clara's finger rested against the trigger. Vane looked up at the shaft in the ceiling. If this runs year-round, every ranch from here to Dry River will need access. The third man gave a short laugh. You planning to sell water? Vane looked at him. I plan to own the ground around it. Clara's jaw tightened. Vane walked to the wall and took out a small knife. He scratched a mark into the granite. A simple V inside a circle. Clara stared at it. A claim mark. He had been in the cave less than 5 minutes and had already decided it belonged to him. The tracker looked toward the hidden shelf again. Clara saw his eyes narrow. Something had caught his attention. Jasper's tail. Just the last few inches showed beyond the rock. The tracker reached slowly for his revolver. Clara lifted hers. Before either of them moved, a sharp sound came from outside. A rifle shot. All 3 men turned. Another shot followed. Then someone shouted from the draw. Vane! The pale-hatted man swore and rushed toward the entrance. The others followed. Within seconds, Clara heard boots scraping through the passage. Then hoofbeats. Fast this time. Moving away. Clara stayed behind the horse. She counted to 50. Then 100. Only after the sound had disappeared did she lower the revolver. Jasper stepped out from the shadows. Clara went to the wall. She stared at the fresh V scratched into the granite. Then she took Thomas's knife from her belt. She drove its point into the mark. One hard stroke, then another. She cut across Vane's symbol until nothing remained but rough lines. Jasper walked to the pool. Clara looked toward the entrance. They'll come back. The horse drank. Clara looked at the water, then at the garden soil hidden beneath the blanket, then toward the distant opening above. A cave could hide a widow. A spring could save her. But water this clean, in a country this dry, could also bring every desperate man for 50 miles straight to her door. And now one of them knew exactly where that door was. Vane returned before sunrise. Clara heard him long before she saw him. Not 1 horse this time. 6. The sound rolled through the narrow draw in broken bursts. Iron shoes striking stone, stopping, moving again. Jasper lifted his head from the pool. Clara was already awake. She had spent most of the night moving what she could. The seed pouch went inside a crack behind the moss wall. The blanket came off the garden plot. She covered the young plants with loose branches and thin slabs of stone, leaving small gaps so they could still breathe. Then she filled every container she owned. Canteen, cooking pot, 2 leather bags, even Thomas's old coffee tin. If Vane took the spring, she wanted enough water to survive at least a few days outside. A man's voice carried through the fissure. Bring the tools. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. Tools. They were not here to inspect the cave. They were here to take it. She slid Thomas's revolver into her belt and led Jasper toward the passage at the rear of the chamber. There was no true second exit. But during the previous afternoon, Clara had found something she had missed before. Behind the moss curtain, where cold water seeped from the wall, a narrow shelf climbed upward. It was barely wide enough for a person, not for Jasper. She looked at the horse. His copper coat had begun to shine again. The swelling in his leg was almost gone. He could walk. He could even trot. But he could not climb that shelf. The first man entered the cavern. Clara heard his boots. Then Vane's voice. Bring the lantern. She tightened her hand around Jasper's rein. The horse looked at her. Clara whispered, Not yet. Men moved through the chamber. One kicked aside stones. Another laughed when he found the pool. Water splashed. Someone began filling canteens. Then came the scrape of metal against rock. Clara leaned around the edge of the moss. Vane stood beside the entrance with a folded paper in his hand. 2 men were hammering iron stakes into cracks around the pool. Another was measuring the width of the chamber with a rope. The tracker from the previous day was examining the floor. He found Clara's garden within minutes. His boot pushed one covering branch aside. Green leaves appeared beneath it. He stopped. Vane. Everyone turned. The tracker crouched. He uncovered a squash vine. Then another. Vane came closer. He stared at the plants. These didn't grow wild. No. Vane touched the soil. His fingers came away dark. Someone has been living here. Clara watched from 20 feet away. Vane stood and looked around the chamber. Find them. 3 men drew revolvers. Clara backed away. There was no more time. She led Jasper toward the fissure. The horse stopped. Men were between them and the entrance. Clara could not shoot her way through 6 armed riders. She looked up. The ceiling shaft. Sunlight had not reached it yet, but a faint blue circle showed far above. Too high. Then Jasper did something unexpected. He stepped away from Clara. Jasper. The horse kept moving. He walked directly toward the pool. One of the men saw him. Horse. Every head turned. Jasper lunged. He struck the edge of the pool with both front hooves. Water exploded across the stones. The nearest man jumped backward. Jasper spun and kicked. His hoof caught an empty bucket and sent it crashing across the chamber. Men shouted. A lantern fell. Glass shattered. Clara moved. She ran toward the entrance. The tracker saw her. There! Vane turned. Clara reached the fissure before anyone could grab her. She forced herself into the narrow crack. Stone tore her sleeve. Behind her, someone fired. The shot struck granite. Fragments hit the side of her neck. She did not stop. She came out into the morning air and ran downhill. A second shot snapped past her. Then came Vane's voice. Don't kill her. Clara reached a boulder and dropped behind it. She pulled the colt. Men began squeezing out of the fissure one at a time. That narrow entrance was now her only advantage. The first rider emerged. Clara fired into the dirt beside his boot. He threw himself backward into the crack. Next one lands higher, Clara called. Silence. Her arm shook from the recoil. She rested her wrist against the boulder. Vane spoke from inside. Mrs. Mercer. Clara stared at the fissure. He knew her name. You've made this harder than it needs to be. She said nothing. I know who you are. Still nothing. Widow. Dry farm south of Dry River. Husband dead last year. Clara's jaw shifted. Vane continued. You're alone. Jasper suddenly whinnied inside the mountain. A sharp, angry sound. Clara nearly stood. Vane heard the change in her breathing. The horse stays with us unless you come back inside. Clara pressed the barrel against the rock. Touch him and you lose a hand. A man laughed somewhere behind Vane. Vane did not. You found valuable water on unclaimed ground. I found a cave. You found property. Clara looked across the desert. From this height, she could see miles of yellow earth. Far south, a faint line of smoke hung above Dry River. People were cooking breakfast with water they had purchased 1 cup at a time. Vane lowered his voice. You can walk away with money. Clara looked at the fissure. How much? A pause. $200. Clara almost laughed. Instead, she looked down at her torn sleeve. 23 years on a farm. A buried husband. A dry well. A wounded horse. 3 days without water. And Vane had reduced the whole mountain to a number smaller than the price of a good wagon team. No. Vane's boots scraped near the opening. Clara raised the gun. He stopped before appearing. Think carefully. Clara answered. I have. For anyone who has ever had to choose between keeping something safe and using it to keep others alive, the hardest moment is often not the danger. It is deciding who gets to know. Clara had kept the spring hidden because secrecy had protected it. That protection was gone. Vane already knew. Keeping silent now would only make certain that one man controlled the water before the town learned it existed. Clara slowly backed away from the boulder. She could not save the cave alone, so she stopped trying. She turned south, toward Dry River. Then she ran. Vane came out behind her. He did not fire. He shouted instead, "Marlowe, take 2 men and bring her back." Clara reached the lower wash. 3 horses burst from the draw behind her. She could hear them closing. Then another rider appeared ahead. Small, thin, sitting badly in an oversized saddle. Clara recognized the straw hat first. Toby Vaughn. The boy had followed her trail into the mountains. He stared at Clara, then at the armed riders behind her. "Mrs. Mercer?" Clara grabbed his bridle. "Turn around." Toby blinked. "What happened?" "Ride. Ride." They moved south together. Behind them, Marlowe shouted for them to stop. Toby's little mare broke into a gallop. Clara ran beside them until the boy reached down. "Take my hand!" She caught it. Toby pulled while Clara jumped behind him. The mare nearly stumbled under the added weight, then found her stride. The desert opened before them. Dry River lay 6 miles away. 3 armed men were behind. And for the first time since finding the spring, Clara was no longer trying to hide where the water was. She was racing to tell an entire town. The mare hit the edge of Dry River at a dead run. Toby leaned low over her neck. Clara held the back of the saddle with both hands, while dust boiled behind them. 3 riders were still coming. People stepped out of doorways as the mare tore down Main Street. A woman dropped a wash basin. The blacksmith stopped with his hammer raised. Someone shouted Toby's name. Clara slid from the mare before it fully stopped. Her boots struck the ground hard enough to buckle her knees. She caught herself against the hitching rail. "Get everyone to the church." The blacksmith stared at her torn dress and the blood drying along her neck. "Clara?" "Now, Josiah." The old man looked past her. Marlowe and his riders had appeared at the north end of town. Josiah Kedder moved. He grabbed the iron triangle hanging outside his forge and struck it with a hammer. The sharp metal clang cut across Dry River. Once, twice, again. Doors opened. Men came from the feed store. Women stepped out carrying children. The doctor crossed the street, still wearing his stained apron. By the time Marlowe pulled his horse to a stop, nearly 40 people stood between him and Clara. He rested one hand near his revolver. "Move aside." Nobody moved. Marlowe looked at Clara. "Mr. Vane says you've taken possession of land that doesn't belong to you." Clara wiped blood from her neck with the back of her hand. There is water in the broken teeth. The street changed. No one spoke, but faces turned. A tin cup slipped from someone's fingers and landed in the dirt. Clara continued. "A spring inside the mountain. Enough water for people. Enough for animals. Enough to plant." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "She is lying." Toby pushed through the crowd. "I saw it." His Aunt Elizabeth grabbed for his shoulder. Toby stepped away from her. "I followed Mrs. Mercer. I saw the men chasing her." Marlowe looked at the boy. That was foolish. Toby's chin lifted. So was chasing a widow with 3 guns. A few people shifted closer together. Marlowe took his hand away from his revolver. Then another horse entered town. Cyrus Vane rode alone. Jasper followed behind him on a rope. Clara's whole body went still. The old horse was walking. His injured leg held. Vane stopped 30 feet from the crowd. He looked at Clara, then at the people surrounding her. "You should have taken the money." Clara's eyes stayed on Jasper. "Let him go." Vane held the rope. "You first." Josiah stepped beside Clara. His wooden leg struck the ground with a dull knock. "What exactly are you claiming, Vane?" "The spring." "On what deed?" Vane looked at him. "I'll file the claim in Prescott." Josiah folded his arms. "So you don't have one?" Vane's mouth flattened. "The land is open. The doctor spoke from the crowd. "Aye, so is the water." Vane turned in the saddle. "You people have enjoyed access to my well for months." A woman near the church steps raised an empty bucket. "At $2 a gallon." Another voice came from behind her. "My husband worked 3 days for 6 gallons. Vane looked back at Clara. "You think these people will protect your spring?" Clara finally looked away from Jasper. "It isn't mine." That stopped him. Clara pointed toward the mountain. "That's what you don't understand." Vane leaned forward slightly. "Everything belongs to someone," Clara answered. "Then let it belong to Dry River." Marlowe muttered something under his breath. Vane's eyes moved over the crowd. Clara could see him counting. Not people. Odds. He was deciding how much force it would take. Josiah saw it too. He stepped into the street. "You have 4 guns here." Vane glanced at him. Josiah pointed toward the rooftops. "You should count again." Clara looked up. 2 ranchers stood on the hotel porch with rifles. The storekeeper held a shotgun behind a rain barrel. Even old Mrs. Pritchard had come out with her late husband's Winchester balanced across both arms. Nobody raised a weapon. Nobody needed to. Vane released a slow breath through his nose. Then he dropped Jasper's rope. The horse immediately walked toward Clara. She met him halfway. Jasper pushed his forehead into her shoulder. Clara closed one hand around his mane. Vane turned his horse. "This isn't finished," Josiah answered. "Then bring paper next time." Vane rode north. Marlowe and the other men followed. No one fired. The town watched until the riders became small shapes in the heat. Then Elizabeth Vaughn looked at Clara. "How far?" 6 miles. "How much water?" "I don't know." "Enough for all of us?" Clara looked toward the mountain. "If we don't ruin it." That afternoon, Dry River moved. Not as a mob. As workers. Josiah brought picks and shovels. The doctor brought clean bottles. Families brought barrels, ropes, buckets, seed sacks, and every sound container they owned. Clara made them leave the wagons 2 miles from the mountain. No road to the entrance. A farmer frowned. Why? Because roads become ownership. No one argued. They carried the rest by hand. When Clara reached the narrow fissure, she stopped everyone. 6 at a time. The first 6 entered sideways. Josiah went first. Toby followed. Then Elizabeth. Clara stayed outside. She watched their faces disappear into the stone. A few minutes later, Toby shouted from inside. "Aunt Beth!" Then came splashing. Clara lowered her head. Jasper stood beside her. By sundown, the first water barrel was full. By midnight, 4 more stood covered beneath canvas in Dry River. The next morning, men began building a stone catch basin below the spring, careful not to block its flow. Women marked garden beds on the damp soil where the shaft of daylight reached. Toby planted the first squash seed. He pressed it down with one finger. Clara watched from beside the pool. Weeks passed. Green returned first inside the mountain. Beans climbed rope lines. Squash leaves spread across dark earth. Corn rose in short rows. Outside, Dry River remained brown, but barrels stood beside doorways again. Children carried cups without being told to save half for later. Jasper's wound closed into a pale line. One evening, Clara climbed above the fissure. The sun had dropped low over the Arizona plain. Below her, a narrow line of people moved toward town carrying filled water skins. Jasper grazed beside a patch of scrub. Clara took the small leather seed pouch from her pocket. Only 2 seeds remained. She pushed one into the soil near the cave entrance. Then the second. Jasper lifted his head. Clara brushed the dust from her fingers. Far below, someone laughed beside a water barrel. She stood there until the first green shadows reached the base of the mountain. And if stories like Clara's deserve a place beside your evening fire, subscribe and leave a like so the next one can find its way to you.